Society Matters.
Hello and welcome to History Repeats on HMTV. Joining me today is Richard Acritelli, and today we're going to be talking about the end of the war and the liberation of the camps. It is now the 80th anniversary of the end of the war and the liberation of the camps, so let's talk about it. So Richard, in preparation for today, I read a number of books about and articles about the liberation of the camps. Almost to a man, almost every soldier seems to have been completely blindsided by what was going on.
Now, what you're looking at, and thank you for having me today on HMTV, is that, they might have heard some rumors. They knew that the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, intellectuals, all kinds of groups, were deemed as being inferior. They were hurt. They were imprisoned. So they heard the rumors, and you had a lot of soldiers who had family members that were in Europe. They might have left. Yeah. They were fortunate to get out before or right at the start of World War II on September 1st, 1939. So here you have hardened combat soldiers. We're here in Glen Cove at the studio, and there could have been kids here that grew up, played sports, went to school here, and in towns across Long Island. Yeah. And they went into the service, right after Pearl Harbor. When they can go in, they went in. They, left school early. They begged their parents to sign up. They trained through the various military jobs and armed forces. So at this point, 80 years ago, they have a couple different thoughts in their mind. One is it's the end of the war. Yeah. The German front is crumbling. They're heading eastward towards central Germany, Austria, and then the extent of it was into Czechoslovakia. Two is that they're not really sure about the Germans. Yeah. Some of them were fanatical. They were still fighting, but most of the Germans were giving up. There's that famous picture on the Autobahn where you have Americans moving eastward, armor, the logistics, the infantry. They're going eastward.
The Germans are on foot.
As the Germans are on foot, and they're on the Autobahn, and they're marching in order, and they want no business of the Soviets. Yeah. Okay? You have, 27 million people that were killed in the Soviet Union. 3.5 million of them were Soviet prisoners of war. The Soviets want to win the war. They want blood. So you see the prisoners coming, and they're heading westward. So now you see the American soldier, who at this time was the best trained soldier in the world. Yeah. Best equipped, most motivated, best fed, and best led. Yeah. At the start of the war, Bradley looked at the German Wehrmacht, the Blitzkrieg, and said, we had to learn to, walk before we could run. Okay. Now that was 3 years before this here. Yeah. We came a very long way in a very short period of time. American Army officers are very progressive. They're open to change. They see the battlefield, and they change with the battlefield. So now, 80 years ago at this point, April 12th, our Army did a complete 360. Yeah. So now you have American soldiers who believe now that it's possible that they're going to survive. Yeah. Now they go into Germany. They see a lot of similarities with the Germans. Yes. Strong middle class, nice homes, clean towns. They had toilet paper in their homes. They had heat in their homes. The German women were beautiful. So there was a lot of similarities. So you get a lot of American soldiers starting to say, what are we doing here? Why are we here?
Germany didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. Hitler declared war on us. We didn't.
Yeah, 2 days later. Yeah. So, the U-boats were right off of our coast. We knew that the Germans were very dangerous in terms of their military. But, there was some striking similarities. So General Eisenhower was very concerned that, you might not know why you're over here, but soon you're going to learn what you're fighting against. Yeah. And he wasn't completely 100% sure of what we were fighting against. He knew how tyrannical the Nazis were.
From what I read, Roosevelt was informed from at least 1942 that there were mass killings going on. So they knew something was going on, but they didn't know the full extent of it.
Well, they were given a report, him and Churchill, and there were thoughts that the people giving the report were insane because nothing like that could be happening.
Yeah.
That it's war, there's going to be some killings, there's going to be some inhumanity, but nothing to that extent.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at is in Poland and in the western parts of, the Soviet Union, you had those mass killings, and then you had this, the ghettos, and then the extermination camps are set up after the establishment of the ghettos and so on. But it was rumor.
Yeah.
But then word got out, and it kept coming out that this was in fact happening. And if you look at Albert Einstein, he was on Long Island in 1939. He was out in Peconic.
Oh, I didn't know that.
2 FBI agents got lost looking for him in the day, like New Suffolk Point. So what they were bringing him was the response of President, FDR, Roosevelt, to say to Einstein, get your friends together and build the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
So here you have, Einstein, who's a pacifist, but he escapes from Germany, goes to England, and then comes over here. And a lot of the scientists had very similar experiences, and they knew what Hitler was capable of doing, and they knew in terms of technology that these weapons could and would be produced, and that it was believed that the Germans were a little ahead of us.
Yeah.
So you had those fears within the government, but here you had the American first, really up until about December 6, 1941.
Yeah.
And then after Pearl Harbor, those people who said that we shouldn't be getting involved were signing up for the military right away. So it changes very quickly. But you only hear that the people weren't really treated the greatest, right? So at this point, 80 years ago, you have American soldiers who are looking around and kind of wondering, what are we doing here? So it was a very eye-opening experience for a lot of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids.
I can imagine. It's my understanding that as the Allies were moving in there, and we first discovered the first camp, I believe it was called Camp Ohrdruf?
Ohrdruf. Yep.
On April 4th, 1945. The camps the Americans generally, they found, were these extermination camps or were these work camps?
Well, it's a good question. This late in the war, central Germany was probably one of the worst places to be.
Yeah.
Because when you think of Auschwitz, that's hell on earth, right?
Yes.
It's a horrible place. You had just the killings were on such an industrialized site there, right? At Birkenau, and then working people to death and so on. But that was one of the first places to be liberated. So that doesn't make things any better, but geographically, the Soviets are coming in from that direction.
Yeah.
When you look at, Dachau, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, okay, just to name a few, they were the last places to be liberated.
Yeah.
So now, at this point, there's no food. The Germans are getting tired of the war. The SS are now holding on to the camps, but now they're knowing that these places are going to be liberated.
Yeah.
And now they're going to be held accountable. So now Ohrdruf is in early April, about a week ago, 80 years ago. General Eisenhower, he was a very bright individual, obviously being a 5-star general, but he was a little bit of a regular guy too. Yeah. And he, like I said earlier, he was concerned about the American soldiers not really being sure. So he goes into Ohrdruf. He's got General Omar N. Bradley, the head of American Ground Forces, and he's got General George S. Patton, who fights during World War I, leads our first armor during World War I in France. And in World War II, he was, our pit bull. He ended up started the bleeding, or he ended the bleeding. So he was a very, very strong combat leader, very controversial.
Yes.
But he was there to do some fighting and to lead the soldiers in very difficult spots. So here you have...
he led the liberation at this camp.
Well, yeah, it's going to be elements, okay, of American forces. The generals are in the rear.
Yep.
It's the colonels, lieutenant colonels, the majors who are going to be the first ones in there. So they come in about a week after it's liberated, and they couldn't believe at what they were saying.
Yeah.
So they are looking at prisoners that won't look at you, okay, that are surviving, by, the skin of their teeth. They have no nutrients in their body. You have typhus in the camps. You have American soldiers that are enraged at what they're seeing.
Yeah.
Because our principles here, okay, things haven't always been perfect in the United States. You have segregation, you have anti-Semitism. There have been a lot of things over history that hasn't necessarily made sense over here.
Yeah.
But we've never done anything like this before.
No.
So, and now you have American soldiers who are looking forward to the end of the war. They're looking forward to surviving. Now they go through the camps, and now they realize exactly what they've been fighting against.
Yeah.
Because they might have been fighting against German middle class, but it was that German middle class that was looking to keep that tyrannical government, the Nazi regime, in power. Yeah. That's the thing. That's the concern. So now Eisenhower goes in, and you could see it here at the Nassau County Holocaust Museum, where just a look of disgust on Eisenhower's face. You look at Bradley, same thing. Patton, he got sick. He went on the side of one of the buildings, one of the huts, and he threw up. And wow. Here's just some information in terms of what some of their feelings were.
Yeah, I read some of these quotes. They're quite striking.
Oh, it's unbelievable. So when you look at Eisenhower, okay, he's going to say to General George C. Marshall, and Marshall had an idea these things were going on, but they weren't quite sure the extent of it. So now Eisenhower reports these accounts to Marshall, and he says, "The most interesting, although horrible sight that I encountered during a trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw begged the description. While I was torn at camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one rouse another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as it was to leave me a bit sick." Now, this is, what Patton would say. Patton, a major fighting general during the war, observed, "You'll never believe how bastardly these crowds can be until you've seen one of these pest holes for yourself," being in the concentration camps.
That's a hell of a description. And this was a sub-camp. This was not a main concentration camp.
This was a work camp, but the problem was there was no food, there was no resources, there was conflicting orders from the German high command. Himmler, who was one of Hitler's main henchmen, Reichsfuhrer Himmler, he tried to curry favor by saying, "I'm going to stop the killings," or "I have ordered to stop the killings in places like Buchenwald." And he presented this to the Swiss government. You got to remember, the Germans still spoke to us through third parties. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, and Spain. So, and we sent messages to them, especially through the large amount of prisoners of war they were holding on to. Okay. So he was saying, well, I stopped the killings. And he thought this was currying favor with the Allies. It didn't matter. Okay, because at this time, people were still dying in huge numbers. And then there was other reports, like when you look at the Commandant of Buchenwald, he ended up coming out and saying, these people are all going to be witnesses, and they're all going to testify against us. So there had to be more killings to prevent this word from coming out. So you have conflicting reports. It's a very confusing time in April of 1945.
This commandant of Buchenwald, is this the same commandant whose wife had a very interesting habit of collecting tattoos?
No, that was the first one. His wife was, they called her the bitch of Buchenwald. She would ride around the camp on a horse.
Yeah.
She would whip the prisoners. You know, you're looking at just heinous treatment. And what she ended up doing was, when the prisoners died through whatever means the Germans had used, torture, starvation, you had 8,000 Soviet prisoners of war that were shot there. If those survivors had tattoos on their body, she had people take the skin off, and they would make bookcases, lampshades out of the human skin itself.
Wow. Regular Ed Gein. All right.
But this is the thing that American soldiers couldn't fathom.
I can't fathom it.
How could you do this? And you got to remember, these camps were not just out in the countryside somewhere, right? You know, Sachsenhausen was 2 miles outside of Berlin.
Yeah.
You know, Dachau was, outside of Munich. So they weren't all just isolated posts. People sooner or later understood what was going on in those camps.
Yeah. One of the other things I had read is that by 1945, the number of people in these camps had actually increased to something like 700,000, 715,000. Why was that? Was that just people being relocated as the Allies advanced?
Well, that was part of it, right? And when Auschwitz gets liberated, there's people that are liberated there, but they moved out probably 3/4 of that camp.
Yeah,
I knew one man, Werner Reich, who's here in this museum, and he was in 4 camps. He was at camp in Yugoslavia. He was at the phony camp at Theresienstadt. He was at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And then he got liberated at Mauthausen.
Yes.
So now I'm a teacher, and I believe very strongly in this type of history. Okay, it's extremely important because we're getting further away from it.
Yes.
So I had him speak to my students in a big assembly, but I had the man that liberated him speak, a man named John D'Aquila. Okay, he was a medic. He slept on a dead cow in France during the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
He was one of those soldiers who did not believe he was going to survive because the Germans, they were not consistent, okay, in terms of how they were responding and having their towns overrun.
Yes.
Some of them were fighting, some were not. He thought that he was going to end up dying, that his luck was going to run out.
Yeah.
So he goes into Mauthausen concentration camp. Austria is a beautiful country. You have the mountains, beautiful towns, the landscape. So now John D'Aquila is a combat medic, and they're about a mile and a half outside the camp, and all of a sudden, there's the smell of death. So they know that going into these areas that they're smelling this, but they can't put their finger on it, what exactly it is. Now, years later, he was in Lower Manhattan right after 9/11, and he smelled the same smell because of Ground Zero. So now he goes in the camp, and if you were sent to Mauthausen, you were sent there to work to death. They had a big stone quarry there. It was a brutal camp in Austria. And they called some of the Austrians some of the best Nazis in terms of being the most fanatical. Okay?
Hitler was.
So, right, Hitler's Austrian, the Bavarian corporal, the whole 9 yards, right? So now when you look at Mauthausen, Werner Reich was sleeping next to a dead body. And he said, and he would talk to the students, and he would point to John D'Aquila and goes, if it wasn't for that man right there, I would have been dead within a day or two. Because I did not have enough nutrients in my body to survive. So now if we have time for a quick story with Werner Reich. I served in the military. I was never in combat. I'm honestly big into history. I've kind of researched this a little bit, but I've never heard a story like this before. So he goes, I'm liberated, and I see American soldiers, and they're all over the camp. They give him food, water, treatment. There's prisoners that are dying at that very moment, even though they're liberated. Mm-hmm. And he goes, I'm seeing American soldiers chewing on this substance, and they're spitting it out. And he said, I'm starving, and I come across this can, and I start chewing and eating it. Oh. And he goes, it was chewing tobacco. So here he goes, I survived selection with Dr. Joseph Mengele. Yeah. I survived a forced march out of Auschwitz into Germany. I lose a couple of my feet in terms of frostbite, toes, frostbite. I almost died of a can of chewing tobacco because I had no nutrients in my body. So now you're listening to him tell the story and your mouth hits the ground. Yeah. And he was like, kid, it's all right, take it easy, this stuff will get done. And then he showed a picture to my students of him at Auschwitz. I believe he was like 12 years old, and he goes, there's the criminal, being myself. So he was a German Jew who went to Yugoslavia, and he was hidden with partisans. Yes. And they were filmmakers, and then they got arrested. And he goes, I don't know why my parents would hide me with them. And then when he was imprisoned, he saw his mother walking away for the last time. He was in the top floor of a cell, and that was it. So you have a lot of these stories here on Long Island, big time.
Wow. That is, wow. I had read when the Dachau, which was one of the later ones to be liberated on April 29th, it broke them mentally. They just rounded up all the guards there and shot them all. I think that just goes to show you the sort of thing.
Well, when you look at Dachau, Dachau was opened in 1933. Mm-hmm. I believe it was about 3 months before FDR first term. Yeah. So look at the timetable there. FDR is a 4-term president. He's a Great Depression president. He's a World War II president. Mm-hmm. Right? So he dies before Dachau is liberated and Truman takes office, right? Yeah. For almost his extent of his presidency, Dachau was operational. And that was a model camp, meaning that if you were a concentration guard or if you were SS or you were some sort of supervisor in the camps, you went to Dachau and you learned that specific trade at Dachau. Mm-hmm. That was a huge, huge camp. And what you're learning with a lot of the prisoners that there was they ended up with slave labor for a lot of the industrial. Remember Speer in 1945, he ends up having still, even as Germany's getting pounded, a tremendous amount of war-making capabilities. Yeah. And it's all that slave labor. So, and Americans, again, now this is a couple of weeks after Buchenwald. Now, this is a quote, okay, of Edward R. Murrow, okay, from CBS, right? So Murrow goes into Buchenwald on this day, 80 years ago, April 12th. He goes, I reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. So whether you were George S. Patton and all you saw for a couple of years was killing and the movement of armies and constantly looking, okay, to defeat the opposing force or a war correspondent, it was the same belief of how could something like this happen? And that was beyond rumors and beyond things that you weren't quite sure about. This was the truth. It did happen.
Yes. I guess one last thing. The sort of people that were brought to these camps, were they exclusively Jewish people?
No. I mean, it's going to be mostly Jews. I think it was by 1937, 1938, Dachau, their population was mostly Jewish. Yeah. But what you're looking at is gypsies, homosexuals, trade unionists, communists, intellectuals. You had resistance that was brought there. Heck, Stalin's son was captured, and Stalin would not even entertain taking his own son back because he saw the Soviet prisoners of war as given up.
Yeah.
So he was in a concentration camp, and he ended up dying there. You had some American soldiers that ended up in concentration camps where, the German Luftwaffe, for whatever reason, they were in some of the camps. They said, what are those men doing here? They don't belong here. They belong in prisoner of war camps. Why? Because they were concerned about reprisals.
Yes.
Okay, you had German prisoners of war here on Long Island and throughout the country.
Yes.
All right, so it's mostly Jews, but it's one thing with the Holocaust, things don't make sense. And, you have, many groups that Hitler saw as being threats to the Third Reich.
Okay. Well, thank you, Richard. That's all for now.